Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review, and in this video I'm going to review There Existed an Addiction to Blood by Clipping. Clipping has easily been one of the most interesting, one of the most innovative and one of the most different experimental hip-hop groups I've stumbled upon in recent years, mainly because it's one of the very few occasions where you see this tight combination of hip-hop music with elements of harsh noise. This is not something that I've seen other artists do as good as Clipping, and especially with their second album, the self-titled one, it was truly one of the most exceptional and one of the most interesting works I've heard from hip-hop music in recent years. In my opinion, the material this album offers makes it easily one of the most interesting and one of the most intense and unique albums I've heard from this decade. And pretty much everything about this album was on point. The instrumentals were incredible, there was amazing production to this album, and even the harsh noise segments were some of the most professional I would ever hear in an album. And David Giggs, he's an incredible rapper, one of my favorite rappers currently. He has an amazing flow, and we're talking about a great lyricist as well. His lyrics are truly spectacular, definitely one of my favorite rappers when it comes to lyrical content, and he also has a great speedy flow, and it's also incredible how comfortably he can rap over pretty much anything, from straight up harsh noise segments with no beat to them whatsoever, to even an alarm clock, or even some weirdly timed signatures like with the track Story 2. The previous effort of the group with the album Splendor or Misery was an album that definitely had a quite solid and interesting concept behind it, but it would mostly be based around that concept, leading to some tracks that were quite short, felt a bit unfinished, and some really uninteresting instrumentals which would only be based around some background sounds. And so I wasn't that impressed with this album. I thought it was a little bit disappointing. But I was still definitely looking forward to what they were about to do next, because still I think that Clipping have a lot to offer in the hip hop scene. And There Existed an Addiction to Blood was a really interesting change of direction from Clipping, as it seemed, with the release of the very first teaser track, Nothing Is Safe, which contained some stuff that were usual for Clipping. It has this repeated monotone piano tone and a simple bass line, and in general it's just David Giggs rapping over this monotone piano melody, which is the only thing that keeps the tempo for over half of the song. But then you have this overblown chorus with this really amazing overblown saw synth, and also a really interesting trap beat. This is actually the very first time I feel that we have a direct embodiment of a trap beat over here, and it actually works really well. Once again, David's flow is really speedy, it's really good, the lyrics on this thing are incredible, and the more I listened to this track, the more it became a grower on me. I was a bit indifferent at first because I thought it was a bit repetitive, but this melody is so spectacular, and I love the horror aesthetic to this song, which is also something that we see on the second teaser track, La Mala Ordina, which is a track I would not anticipate it would be a thing, since this track features the Rita. Yes, the Rita, the one artist who is known for making these really intense harsh noise wall albums. I'm not the hugest fan of the works of the Rita, even though I can definitely say he has some of the most interesting harsh noise wall works out there, but I would never expect the exposure of such an underground name like the Rita. This was a really interesting and pleasant surprise, and not only that, but this track works amazingly well. At first I thought the other features from Elcamino and Benny the Butcher, I thought they were not something really that interesting, but the more I listen to this song, the more I think that their feature fits perfectly in this occasional song, and I actually like the deliveries from both of them having this East Coast vibe in this really creepy and disturbing beat, which sounds really sickening, and it has an old school horrorcore aesthetic to it. But the first time I listened to this song, I was half point to the song and I was really curious how the Rita is going to be part on this song, and it's pretty much what I expected. The Rita covered the entire second half of the song. As it progresses, it gets more and more distorted, and then it gets so overblown and so messy that we have an incredibly intense wall of noise. This feature from the Rita would not work any better. This is possibly one of the best way I would see an artist get featured on a song. And it works amazingly well, exceeding my expectations. And this is a great sound from the Rita as well. His wall of noise on this particular thing sounds more intense and more incredible than ever. And the thing with harsh noise wall is that it usually just takes for such a long period of time, but in this particular occasion it works pretty well, just exceeding this horror aesthetic and giving it a different and more intense mood. But for this to actually be your second teaser track, that is a really bold move, and it's really nice to see artists like this getting more recognition. And one of those features that I wouldn't expect and I was definitely excited to listen to was the one with Pedestrian Deposit on the track Atonement. This track just starts with a heavily free improvised harsh noise segment from Pedestrian Deposit, and it works astonishingly well. Then the track keeps a pattern, but it's a harsh noise one. This is one of those songs where David Giggs raps over some noise sounds once again, and this is an incredible track. There are some of the speediest and some of the craziest flows on the entire album in this song. And also, this is easily one of the darkest and one of the most depressing songs Clipping have ever done, like ever. This track just sounds so grim, it sounds so filthy, which is pretty much an aesthetic that I get with the entirety of this album. I would say that this is possibly the darkest thing they've ever done. There is little to no catchiness to this thing. Most of the tracks have little to no beats to them, and just the catchiness of some of their previous albums is not there anymore. Definitely some of the catchier moments actually come from some of the teaser tracks, which these ones by themselves are really dark. Which is also the case with tracks like Blood of the Fang, the third single, which is possibly one of my favorite songs of the album, if not my favorite. I just love Blood of the Fang. It's an incredible song, and it's also one of the more straightforward tracks from Clipping. It's not one of those where it gets really experimental, it's not one of those where it gets really harsh with its sounds, but everything about it works perfectly. The samples are incredible to this thing. The beat is absolutely intense, really minimal, really simplistic for its most part, but the feels on this thing are absolutely intense. We also have a really nice, sort of catchy but extremely haunting and unnerving chorus. We see one of the most insane deliveries from David Giggs, some of his speediest flows, some of his greatest lyrics, and we also have one of the best video clips from this year. Really weird one, really bizarre, but definitely one of a kind video clip. Halfway towards the album are some of those tracks that didn't really grab my attention all that much. There were some of those moments where I felt like the tracks were going closer to some of the elements that I didn't enjoy as much from the album Splendor or Misery, mainly because I didn't feel that much of a focus of a specific melody or just a specific something when it comes to the production. Some of the tracks once again felt a lot like background sounds, which was the case with tracks like He Dead, which is actually though a really good song in my opinion. I really love the delivery from Ed Balloon. I think the chorus on this thing is incredible. David Giggs once again, he has some incredible flows on this thing and some great lyrics. And there is no beat to it, it's just straight up ambience, and as the song progresses, it actually gets a bit more intense and more intense. And I think the melodies to this track are actually quite good. There are some really interesting sounds to this thing. But then we have tracks like Clap Down, which is possibly my least favorite track out of the album, mainly because I didn't really enjoy that monotone sound to it. David Giggs' delivery on this thing is quite intense, but I wasn't really a fan of the chorus, and I think that some of the vocal and singing parts on the second half of the song were a bit off-putting, and the whole intensity of this track didn't lead up to something that was really that much interesting to me. Another track that I didn't really enjoy that much at first was the track Run For Your Life, mainly because I thought the beat to this thing was not that much interesting, but the beat comes to the second portion of the song. The first one is mostly David Giggs rapping over some field recordings, which is actually a really good idea, and I think they've done an incredible job on these field recordings working together as a whole thing, and so I end up liking the track more and more as I kept listening to it, but it's still not one of my favorite moments, and I don't think it has one of the better features on this thing. Another thing that kind of hurts for this album in my opinion was some of the interludes. They were not bad in any occasion, but never did I feel that they offered something more to the album. One thing they managed to do really well though is to get you in this horror vibe and this horrorcore aesthetic, especially with the interlude Possession, which is a 2-minute track that feels like it has a sample from an old school horror movie, but then other than this point, the rest of the album is absolutely stunning. When we get towards the end of the album, we get some of the best songs out of this entire thing. There Existed an Addiction to Blood has some incredible ideas, definitely some of the most innovative and some of the best from Clipping, with tracks like The Show, which is an incredible track that has a heavy vibe of the track Baby Don't Sleep from their previous album, which was actually one of my favorite works out of the album, mainly because it was based around some noise sounds which are incredible on The Show. They feel extremely well put together and they set a great tone for just being the main melody that drags the entire song. It's one of the shorter ones and it works really well for being short. It has a really solid clap sound to it, and then we get into the track All in Your Head, which is such a mind-blowing track, especially with the features on this thing. This has possibly one of the best set of features I've ever heard in a track. This track just has done such a great job with the features. It just contains 3 separate parts and David Giggs just takes a really small portion of the track, and I love how he just gives such freedom for the rest of the artists to express themselves. The first one from Robyn Wood, it's this really weird spoken word part with such a bizarre amount of effects throughout her entire delivery. There is an intense sub-bass line that gets distorted at times and glitchy, and it feels like I'm just sent into another world, and it's one of a kind experience. And then towards the second half of the song, you have Counterfeit Madison singing in this glorious gospel tone over this really distorted and really weird sub-bass line, and then the track gets more and more distorted, and then it gets so overblown, it gets so epic. The combination of the sounds on this thing, the way it just transitions to so many different elements, it's actually mind-blowing. I'm really curious how they just got up with this idea, how they managed to do this, how they were like, this is what we're going to do. And it's amazing how well the features work on this thing. And also I have to give a special mention for Story 7, because how the fuck did David Giggs manage to rap over this thing? How they just managed to think of this? It might not be as impressive or as epic as Story 2 out of the album Clipping, because this track was heavily emotional to its sounds, and as it would progress it would get more and more epic. Story 7, it's a bit more laid back with its production, it has a more simplistic tone to it, it's just based around a really glitchy beat, but it's in such a weird time signature where I'm just like, okay, with some of the other songs I can just get that, okay, he has a speedy flow, it's difficult to rap over this, but I really can't catch up with Story 7. This is such a weird track. I don't know how he managed to rap over this, how he just had the idea of when he would go on beat, because this thing just constantly changes over and over and it's just so weirdly off-putting. And then the album ends with the 18-minute track Piano Burning, which is actually what I was hoping this track was going to be, and this is actually a field recording of what is supposed to be a piano on fire, which is a really interesting way to end this album, that's for sure. Is it one of my favorite moments in the album? No, I wouldn't say so. It's a long-winded track, it goes for a very long period of time, but it's a really interesting and unique way to set the ending tone of the album. It's a bit of a chill track, it's a bit soothing, you just hear the fire in the background, there are some weird noises here and there from some piano clicks, you can also hear the crickets for about 18 minutes and that's about it. What can I say about this album? This has become a grower. The more I listen to this thing, the more I just realize that this is easily the best rap album I've heard from this year. Even if there were parts towards halfway of the album that I didn't really enjoy that much, and even though I think that some of the interludes were a bit forgettable, I just really mesmerized and overwhelmed by this whole experience. It might not be my favorite Clipping album, it's really hard to surpass the self-titled one, but we're definitely talking about the darkest work from Clipping, we're talking about some of the greatest flaws of David Giggs and some of his greatest lyrics, and even though Clipping was a really unique and one-of-a-kind album, this one is even more innovative, it feels more mature, we see the group actually getting more obscure, creative and innovative, and it easily has some of the most interesting set of features I've ever seen in a hip-hop album. With that being said, this album has managed to be a grower on me, there are some incredible ideas on this thing, some of the most refreshing ones I've heard in hip-hop like ever, and this is a definite recommendation for me. I'm going to give this album an 8 out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.